Strategic Affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and today we're discussing the annual India-Japan Prime Ministerial Summit. Joining us from Stockholm is our guest, expert, and analyst, Dr. Jagannath Panda. Now he has lots of new hats on his head. He is the head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Institute for Security and Development Policy, that's ISDP, based in Stockholm. He's also the director of the Europe-Asia Research Cooperation at the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies in Japan, and is a well-known editor and author as well. Dr. Panda, good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Revi. It's a great pleasure to come back to your show.
Dr. Panda, the differences over condemning Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, what is your assessment on the impact on, say, bilateral relations between India and Japan and in the Quad of that post the public statements that have been made?
I think we have to understand in the whole gamut of the background that is taking place. I think many countries are caught in the middle, not only India, but many countries across the world. They do not really want to take a position when it comes to Russia and Ukraine crisis concern. So I think India not taking a position itself is a position. And I think the Japanese have started realizing that. But as it goes with India-Japan, friendship and partnerships that is emerging for the last 1 decade or so, I think there is a little more expectation from the Japanese side on India on the issue, given the fact that Japan's most important strategic and military alliance partner, that is the United States of America, continuously condemning the Russian actions and war path in Ukraine. And I think there the Japanese expectations, both as a special partnership of India and also as a quad partner of India in the Indo-Pacific, comes as at a large. And I think the Japanese expectation from India also comes to the fact that India should take a position when it comes to the global narratives and power politics is concerned. And I think the Japanese would like to see more and more India aligning more with the Indo-Pacific politics, supporting the Japanese global narrations, condemning the Chinese actions, condemning the Russian actions, and condemning, most importantly, the authoritarian actions that the world politics is currently dealing with. And I think to that extent, I think there has been a difference between Japan and India, and there is a expectation from the Japanese side. Many analysts, policymakers in Japan, they do expect a strong voice from India, but I think we need to understand India's relationship with Russia, that Delhi certainly cannot be so open about Russian attack in Ukraine.
You've written about it, Dr. Panda, the worries that one, the focus may shift away from the Indo-Pacific and the main threat, which is China, and whether in the Quad, because all the other three are, as you pointed out, treaty allies, and they have very strong stances publicly, and whether it's on sanctions as well vis-a-vis Russia. Do you see it impacting the Quad in any manner?
Not really. I think a Quad has actually emerged as a cohesive grouping. In fact, if you see the last 3 to 4 years evolution of the Quad, there is a certain degree of maturity is reflected in the Quad groupings. They do understand there is always a national interest, there is always a national security interest, and Quad countries will hold different opinions on critical global issues. So there is nothing called that all the Quad countries will have an agreement on critical issues. What I think the Quad has helped most of the countries, particularly all these 4 countries, to come together and to build a consensus. So when it comes to Ukraine and Russia crisis, I think both India and Japan, along with US and Australia, probably built a consensus to condemn the authoritarian action and to condemn the Russia's action plan, the war pathways in Ukraine. But when it comes to relationship pattern, and I think they do understand that each country will have a separate path to follow, and to that extent, I think Japan realizes that India will have its own solid partnership with Russia, because of its defense partnership, because of its security partners, and most importantly, India and Russia are multilateral partners. So I don't think the difference of opinion or the difference of standpoint on the Ukraine issue will really create a feature in Quad countries. And I think there are many greater issues, be it North Korea issue, Iran issue, Indian Ocean, South China Sea, including the most sensitive one, that is the China's authoritarian practices in the Indo-Pacific. Not all the Quad countries have an agreement on this issue. So I think the Quad is certainly going through a period where they are having a lot of consensus among themselves, but an agreement will be an over expectation at this moment.
What was important from in the briefings from both sides, Indian and Japanese, was that the individual positions vis-a-vis China were conveyed. I mean, the Foreign Secretary talked about the issue at the LAC, and the Japanese talked about both as you pointed out, the East China Sea and the South China Sea. So the focus there still is on the Indo-Pacific and the China threat.
Of course, I think the way the China's foreign policy and China's action plan in the Indo-Pacific is enlarging, there are concerns and there are increasingly security threats. During the pandemic, before the pandemic, we have seen the way the Chinese have behaved towards India, behaved towards Japan, behaved towards Australia during the pandemic. And I think there is a certain degree of consensus among the Quad countries, including especially between India and Japan, that both the special partners needs to stand against China. And I think the joint statement increasingly suggesting that. And what also interestingly, the joint statement suggests that I think there is a need for an exclusive partnership between India and Japan because the region needs it. We certainly cannot really expect everything from the viewpoint of Quad. We certainly cannot expect everything from a US-led architecture point of view. And I think what India and Japan's joint statement is giving us to think is that I think there is a role, there is a context to play for both India and Japan in Indo-Pacific in a much greater way. And I think there, both India and Japan needs to build a leadership partnership. And this leadership partnership today is being reflected in a comprehensive range of areas, be it security, be it economics, be it sustainable developments to partnership in the scale of infrastructure to connectivity. And I think this is a much needed partnership. And the sentiment that we are getting from the joint statement is definitely against the authoritarian practices, against the China's action plan in the Indo-Pacific.
Right. Like we have the issue on the LSE with China, Japan itself has had issues with both Russia and China, whether it's the Senkaku Islands or the Kuril Islands. If you could put that in perspective with the current geopolitical scenario vis-a-vis Russia and China.
I think if we see the China-India context, the way Beijing has actually behaved towards India on the line of actual control and trying to derail the negotiation process just before the pandemic and during the pandemic, that is a worrisome factor for India and many other countries in the Indo-Pacific, including Japan. But what is interesting here to see and note is that I think the China's aggressive stance and assertive behavior is reflected both on the land corridor and also on the maritime corridors, on the maritime regions. And this is where Japan has reasons to worry, because there is a constant evolving understanding happening between China and Russia against Japan, between China and a range of other countries, including North Korea in the regions, which is against the Japanese security interest. And Japan has reasons to worry about this. In fact, if you see the Japanese foreign policy context, Japan's official defense white paper, is actually constantly referring to China threat. Now also have started mentioning about North Korea and also about Russia. So I think Japanese security interest is definitely being pointed, and Japan is making clear that it needs new alliance partners, new alignment partners, and new strategic partners in the regions. So to that effect, I think given the kind of security threat concerns both Japan and India face from China, there is a definitely solid understanding is emerging for last few years, and all the credits to the current leadership in Delhi and Tokyo. But while saying that, I think this this chemistry between India and Japan is evolving for a number of reasons. One, of course, because of the special chemistry that is there between the two leadership, but also because of the strategic requirements of both the countries. And these strategic requirements are increasingly running to face the China threat. And this strategic requirement for Japan is to face the China threat not only on the maritime domain but also on the economic domain. China is a greater security concern, economic concern for Japan in Southeast Asia. From India's point of view, probably not so much when it comes to the economic quotient of China, but definitely we know for a fact that in the boundary regions, China is emerging as a greater military force. And this shared security interest, security concern, bringing India and Japan together against China.
Right. I mean, in fact, current Prime Minister Kishida is vastly experienced. When he was foreign minister, we had played out those pictures there of both his visits to Beijing and China. But just moving away, before I come to the economic aspect of the relationship, Dr. Panda, India and Japan's defense relationship has also progressed. There is a logistics agreement. There are lots of, whether it's the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy who have joint exercises. In Milan, they were there as well, Malabar exercises. That has also progressed a lot, right?
Yes, I think the way the relationship is evolving, the key aspect here is, of course, the trade and investment, the economic partnership that is evolving between India and Japan. But on the other hand, the security angle to it, the 2+2 dialogue, the foreign and defense ministers level dialogue that was started in 2019 between India and Japan, that has actually set the tone for a convergence of interest and to have a much more concrete dialogues on a range of issues, including on the maritime issues. Today we have Dharma Guardian exercise between India and Japan. There are Malabar exercise. There are GIMEX exercise, which is maritime exercises between India and Japan. There are also, as you rightly mentioned, that Japan is also invited into the Milan exercise. And more than that, I think what is really bringing India and Japan is the convergence of maritime interest. If we talk about India and Japan specifically, Prime Minister Modi is talking about Indo-Pacific Ocean initiatives. For last 2 to 3 years, he is talking about constantly how there is a scope for like-minded countries to come and be a partner in India's India proposed Indo-Pacific Ocean initiatives. And I think to that effect, that actually complements in a big way with Japan's FOIP's outlook, that is free and open Indo-Pacific outlook, that Japan is trying to promote for a decade now. And in fact, today, if we see in the immediate Southeast Asian context, in the ASEAN context, both India and Japan are actually started talking about third country cooperations with a range of countries. In fact, Prime Minister Kishida's visit to India and then going to Cambodia suggests that there is a continuity in this political endeavor. Try to extend the India-Japan partnership going forward to the immediate Southeast Asia region, where Southeast Asia is the key to the Indo-Pacific regions. More importantly, what we need to understand, even though on the one hand the security, the defense partnership evolving, there is a geographical convergence happening between India and Japan as far as maritime security issues are concerned, as far as converging their mutual interest in the region is concerned. In fact, both India and Japan are continuously trying to endorse ASEAN centrality, and they are talking about ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. There is a stress on the rule of law, openness, freedom of navigation, transparency, inclusiveness, transparent infrastructure investment. And I think Kishida's visit to Cambodia also linked to some of these issues, because Cambodia has been a country very much aligned to China. And I think the attempt here has been to make some of these lower income and middle income countries to think that India, Japan can also emerge as greater security provider. And there is merits to tie with India and Japan partnership, because we bring transparency and we bring inclusiveness. And to that effect, I think, as you rightly pointed out, the trade and security partnership is enlarging from time to time. And that is the central aspect of this relationship today.
I'll just get to that, and there are lots of viewer questions as well. But one final question on the security aspect. Now, we've seen in Europe what has happened vis-a-vis Germany and their defense budget because of Russia and Ukraine. Japan, as you alluded to earlier in this conversation, has already started that process because of China, whether it's a white paper, record, defense outlays, more equipment being bought. If you could just put that in perspective, the Japanese defense budget and its constitution, its history.
I think there is a change happening in the Japanese strategic thinking, particularly when it comes to defense modernization or military modernizations, and try to have a credible force with itself. We know for a fact that Japan does not have a kind of a on its own a kind of a military to what they say that it's a self-defense forces. If there is an attack happening on Japan, the forces will take care of it. But I think more important here to note is that from a pacifist foreign policy, how Japan is, transforming gradually to a proactive to active to much more aggressive foreign policy, where it is willing to carry out defense modernization. It is willing to have more proactive measures, defense measures. And today, between India and Japan, there is a lot of defense-oriented agreements has happened. And I think all of this suggests that Japan does not aim to actually restrict itself, relying on the U.S. Security umbrella. And I think Japan wants to move out of the US provided security umbrella, and Japan wants to emerge itself as a credible military power. And to that effect, I think there is an increase in the defense budget. There is a lot of modernization is happening. There is a focus on the cyber security. There is a focus on the submarine technologies. There is a focus on space technologies. And in each of these areas, Japan is willing to partner with India and with many like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific. So it reflects that Japan is continuously changing its mindset when it comes to security and defense posturing of Japanese thinking, and that is rightly reflected in Japan's official position paper. What is also most important to note here is that I think, despite the fact that there are different viewpoints are there in Tokyo or throughout Japan about Japan not really having an active military or a kind of proactive military and defense forces, modernized defense forces, but I think there is a political consensus has been built, even though the Kishida's party is in power for a long time in Japanese history. But I think across the political parties, there is a political consensus is emerging that Japan needs to carry out defense modernization. Japan needs to have a much more concrete, focused, and much more overarching security mandate to its foreign policy outlook. And to that effect, I think the defense budget is increasing every year, and there is a specific mention about Japan's security concern and threat in its official articulations, and therefore we will see Japan emerging more as a greater security actor, and India should look forward to Japan as a partner. And this is what the joint statement also, and particularly Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Kishida's summit also indicates to us to believe that there is a role for India and Japan to play in the critical security and defense area.
As you pointed out, Dr. Panda, the economic relationship is central here. Now, I mean, if you can put into perspective for us these huge numbers that are being talked about in terms of outcomes, 5 trillion yen, that's what, 3,20,000 crore rupees or $42 billion. I beg your pardon, investment target, which has been revised upwards over 5 years. Now, this is a win-win for both sides. I mean, the huge Indian market and India needing finance, etc.
Definitely, I think it's a win-win situation for both the countries at this moment. What is we need to understand is that Japan has got a kind of a green signal, a qualified certificate to its credit when it comes to India's domestic constituency, particularly economic constituency. And I think to that effect, I think Japan has every right to invest and emerge as a greater actor. And also, what we need to understand is that there are currently, almost 1,450 Japanese companies are all across the India. And I think that's a big, big number. Every city are having, some top-notch Japanese companies and Japanese equipments, technologies are becoming very popular in India. More importantly, today, I think to Japan's credit, Japan has almost 11 industrial townships which are successfully established. We have in Rajasthan, Nimrana. We have in Sri City in Andhra Pradesh, and these are actually big examples of how Japan has built its credibility as an economic actor. And more importantly, Japan is the fifth largest source of FDI provider, largest suppliers of official development,
Aid.
investor in India. And I think that's a
Yeah.
big issue, because I think every year, every passing year, the certificate, the certificate becomes invalid, and Japan becomes a key economic actor with a green signal with all the regions in the India. In fact, if you notice today, when we talk about the northeastern part of India,
Mhm.
Japan is the only country which has been given the green signal to invest all across the 8 states in a range of issues, in a range of areas, be it on the sanitization, be it infrastructure development, road and infrastructure. So all this investment that you mentioned about in the next 5 years, is going to cover a range of areas, range of states, and therefore there is a scope for Japan to emerge as the greatest ever economic actor in Indian domestic market. There are examples like Mumbai, Ahmedabad, the high-speed rail networks. There are dedicated freight corridors. Metro projects are there. Delhi Mumbai industrial corridors, and all of these initiatives are actually bringing Japan into the radar of India's domestic companies and domestic audience to believe that Japan is a credible actor. And I think there is a hope for a greater partnership between India and Japan in times to come.
Dr. Panda, some quick responses if you can give to some of our viewers. Chaitanya M asks, is India and Japan looking at easing restrictions to ensure free movement of labor? India has required the required skilled personnel, and Japan needs a working population to be a thriving economy again.
I think this is a critical issue. So both sides need to talk more, and I think this is what being discussed between the Japanese companies and Indian companies at a corporate level. But there is a green signal given the kind of initiative we are having at the national level, particularly the Skill India initiative in India, that Prime Minister Modi has actually launched for last few years. There is a scope for all the Japanese companies to come here and invest more, pointedly in different sectors. So the labor issue is one issue that needs to be addressed. But yes, I think when it comes to the skill, when it comes to skill management and human resources, there is a greater scope for discussion. And I think if we see the official roadmaps is very clear, there are different mechanisms are there at the commerce minister level, at the foreign ministry level, which are going to look at some of these issues, because the investment packages for next 5 years is going to be very big. But some of the issues are, as you pointed out, some of these issues are unresolved. So I think it will take time. But I think given the mandate that Japan is having as an economic investor in India, particularly as a as a ODA actor, there is a scope that India might revisit some of these norms, particularly in regards to labor law and all.
Sure. Lord Pashupati wants to know, Dr. Panda, what is with the recent flurry of Quad members trying to woo India with investments and statements? Are the Quad members afraid that India might move to the China-Russia bloc? He goes on to say, considering the Chinese foreign minister is also reportedly going to come to India, and there are reports about claims that they're moving back from hot springs.
Well, I think the Chinese claim are time tested, in the sense that it's based on trial and error method. They want to give a statement in public to see the reactions. Whether in actuality there has been a troops withdrawal in the hot spring area, that needs to be seen. But I think the Chinese are also realizing that the world is increasingly coming to a point where physical activities will be on, and diplomacy will take over the pandemic. And I think keeping that requirement in mind, I think the Chinese diplomacy seems to be very active for the next 10 to 12 months, given the kind of backlash they have faced. So I think the statement which is coming, and the interest from the Chinese side that the Chinese authorities will be visiting India is a signal of that. But I think one more thing what we need to note here is that I think Chinese diplomacy is a multi-pronged diplomacy today. They know how to create feature, they know how to create divisions. So every statement which is coming from the Chinese authorities or Chinese foreign ministry or Chinese official media circulations, we need to see it critically, and we need to deconstruct what is there in between those lines. And I think to that effect, I would say that you know troops withdrawal statement is a overstatement. We need to really see whether China has actually withdrawn the troops or not. I'm not in a position to comment on that, but definitely, officially, somebody from MOD or Ministry of External Affairs in India would be in a better position to comment on that. But when it comes to the China's overture towards India about visiting India, trying to have a normal relationship, I don't think this will create features in the Quad formulations. I think Quad has emerged, in fact, as a cohesive group. There is a greater understanding among the Quad countries. Quad is here to stay. So I don't think China can create any divisions and features among the Quad countries. But one thing is very clear: the Chinese are a greater economic actor, and they know that the Quad countries are not in a very good conditions when it comes to their domestic economic situation. And I think there one needs to be very mindful that how the Chinese economic diplomacy will evolve. And I think the Quad countries should stay united and should not allow the Chinese economic diplomacy to take over and create a division among the Quad countries, because we know for a fact that China is a stronger trade partners with Japan, with US, including with Australia. So I think there are lesser rooms for India to worry, more reasons for Japan to worry, primarily because Japan has a stronger trade and economic ties with China. So Japan cannot overlook its relationship with China. So I think the economic part of this logic needs to be taken care of. But I don't think the Chinese are here to create any divisions among the Quad countries.
Important points you're making there. Another question for you, Dr. Panda from Radhakrishnan Sharma. Will the investment from Japan come with strings attached? That is, support for Ukraine in return for the investment?
I think we have to understand in foreign policy and in international politics, there is always a string attached. And no country would probably give us a donations or official, what the Japanese call official development assistance, just with a good note. And I think every foreign policy will have its own requirement, own logics, and one strategic requirements to look after. And I think here, when we are talking about the Japanese investment in India, the Japanese requirement from India would be that India opens up Japan, more open, more prominently, and give the Japanese companies first preference. And also, India takes a back seat when it comes to competing economies like South Korea. South Korea is emerging as a stronger economic investor in Indian context, and there is a new president in South Korea which has just recently been elected. South Korea is showing a lot of economic interest, investment, and security partnership with India. And I think given the way the South Korean companies compete with the Japanese companies, the Japanese investment plan will try to convince the Indian political leaderships and the domestic audience to choose the Japanese technology, Japanese companies, and give preference to the Japanese investment plans rather than any other countries, including the South Korean companies. Similarly, goes with the Chinese investment plan. Of course, we have seen there has been a huge setback about the Chinese investment and India-China economic trade and economic partnership, even though there are the figures still suggest that there are improvement happening in the India-China trade and investment, trade and economic ties. But I think the Japanese are also worried that in the post-pandemic period, probably the Chinese will emerge as a greater economic actor and try to, woo some of the Indian investors and companies, business persons to look for a more stable relationship with China. And I think that is the Japanese worries. And more than that, I think the Japanese expectation from India is to support the Japanese position and be with Japan when it comes to the Indo-Pacific game plan. And I think there the key interest of Japan lies. Japan wants to protect its own sea line of communications, its own interest in the Indian Ocean regions, and also more importantly, Japan wants to emerge as a greater partner with India in the coastal parts, in the coastal regions. We have seen from Andaman Nicobar to the coastal management plan. Japan as a partner is continuously talking with India. So these are bargaining chips that the Japanese would definitely like to have. So we cannot really call it a string, but yeah, definitely every foreign policy will try to have their own national interest, and the Japanese are no interest, no different to that context. And I think the Japanese investment will come with certain interest, and we have to accommodate some of this interest, even though it would be difficult to accommodate all the interest that the Japanese will bring to the negotiating table.
We talked, Dr. Panda, a little bit about the Kuril or the Northern Islands. Another couple of related points here Mike Taran makes. One about Japan recently claiming islands formerly in control of the Russian government in the northern chain, and Jaideep Gadavi, who says India and Japan are development partners in the Russian Far East. How do you see that aspect of the relationship going forward, especially with regard to what's happening in Europe?
I think there was a time 5 years back, there was a time, in fact, the strategic communities in Japan, the strategic communities in India, and also strategic communities in Russia, there was a discussion that whether there is a scope for India, Japan, and Russia trilateral dialogue. But I think that situation now has been buried with Russia's attack on Ukraine. And I think, given the backlash that the Russians are facing in Europe and throughout the world, the Japanese would not like to propose something like that. India would definitely not to go for such a triangularity. So I think there is a very less scope for India, Japan, and Russia triangularity or a tripartite cooperation. But what we can see probably is that probably on a multilateral issues, on a range of multilateral issues, there might be a issue-based cooperation between India and Japan where Russian cooperation might be needed. But while saying that, I think Japan is also increasingly concerned about Russia's maritime ventures in the Northeast Asia. And I think that has been a worrisome factor, because the way the politics in Northeast Asia is situated at this moment, China trying to build up its relationship with Russia, China trying to build up its relationship with North Korea, the Japanese are caught in the middle. The Japanese don't have much options and opportunities to think about their own national interest and protect their national interest. When it comes to the Taiwan issue, also the Japanese are caught in a very delicate situation, because the way the PLA enforcement is happening on the cross-strait regions, particularly on the Taiwan Strait, it is a grave danger for the Japanese security. Should tomorrow PLA occupies Taiwan forcefully, that will actually expose Japan's security to a great extent. So I think Japan is caught in the middle, and there is a room for India and Japan to talk about cooperation in Northeast Asia. But so far, there has not been any concrete discussion. And I think in this discussion, if in future both India and Japan are talking about Northeast Asia cooperation, US will be a factor. And I think we also need to probably take South Korea into account, into confidence, if not as a partner, but into confidence in order to talk about some of these issues.
Dr. Jagannath Panda, absolutely fascinating and a very in-depth analysis. Thank you so much for your time, your experience, and your expertise. Thank you for answering our viewer questions as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Revi, and my great pleasure to be here in your show. And thank you very much for all the audience, and those questions are brilliant. Thank you very much.
Pleasure's been all ours, and do thank our viewers. Do keep coming back and posting your comments and engaging with this video on what Dr. Panda has been saying. Do like it and share the link as well. If you'd like to support us, you can do that. There is a link that I'm putting up on the screen, and it's also there in our YouTube descriptor. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.